my name is Barry Moses from the Spokane tribe. My father was Ed Moses. My grandparents were Gib Eli and Minnie Moses. And so I tell people, we've been around here for a long time. And our family obviously has been here in this area for longer than people can remember, and so it's always interesting for me to have the opportunity to give these kinds of talks and to sort of introduce a little piece of our history and ourselves to the people who are here. I spoke with Deb this morning. She asked me to say a little bit about the rivers in this area, and of course, as we already know, that the rivers were very important for the tribal peoples in this area. Everything that we did, our life ways, our spirituality, our culture, everything centered around the rivers. And particularly the salmon that were coming up the rivers. And so, as I'm sure was already mentioned, there were sites, campsites all along the rivers. One of them very close here to the Spokane house. Others going further up into closer into Spokane, and so it's a very important very important thing for us. One of the things that's interesting, about and I'm not sure about maybe some of the specifics about the history, but the naming of the tribes. I arrived, and Jack was talking about the naming of the tribes, the French influence, and it creates no small amount of confusion because the names that we had for ourselves and our different encampments along the rivers, were really very different than what eventually ended up getting written down and included in the history books. And so the names for ourselves, almost always had reference to the river or the fish or something connected to the river, which gives us an understanding or appreciation of how important the river was to us. And then people always invariably ask at the end of that, well, where does Spokane come from? And Spokane, as I understand it, was actually a person. Well, before that, actually, and just in the language, Spokane was really just the sun. That's all it was, but it was also a personal name of an individual who was the father of Chief Spokane Gary. And as far as I know, I've never read an Indian name for Chief Gary. Getting back to Chief Gary, after he returned from the school in Canada and came back here, the story goes that he set up a school built out of tule mats, sort of a temporary lodge, supposedly down here closer to Spokane, a place called Drumheller Springs. I've been trying to find the traditional name for Drumheller Springs, and I think I may have found it, but I'm not sure yet. But somewhere in that vicinity, he set up a tule mat school, and I guess the reason for that is because there was a source of water there, and there were some other resources there, and it would have been right along a trail that followed from down where downtown Spokane is now, probably about where the falls are, and it would have probably come all the way up to this area and then beyond up up toward Canada and Kettle Falls, probably connecting the two falls, I imagine. And so that was an important stopping off point. And it's interesting, for the personal connection for me, I have two different connections that I'm aware of to that Drumheller Springs site. One of them was I remember being a little boy and driving with my grandmother down Ash Street, just right as it passes that Drumheller Springs, and she looks out there and she sees that spot up there, and she says to me, "Oh, I remember this place." And so even as a kid, I kind of had this sense of like, oh, there's a story to this, and I'm going to see what I can squeeze out of her. Say, well, what do you remember about it? Yeah. And she says, well, I remember when I was a little girl, that we used to ride to Spokane from Welpinit, and that's about, I don't know, 45-mile, distance. And she says, I remember we used to ride in buckboard wagons from Welpinit to Spokane to do shopping for big items, I guess, things that they couldn't get there. And we would start out early in the morning and we'd ride all day long, and we'd get here to this spot, she said, and then we would put up our teepees and we would spend the night, and the next day we'd go into town and we'd buy what we needed. And then we'd come back here, we'd sleep again, and then we would take down our teepees and we'd go back to Welpinit. Well, I went back and tried to figure out in my mind, well, when exactly would this be happening, that she could remember it, And so she was born in 1922, I think it was. So I'm thinking it had to have been, for her to remember this, it had to have been probably the late 1920s or early 1930s. What you think of the big scope of things in history really wasn't that long ago, that folks were still essentially camping in teepees and using that spot. Not within the lifetime or the memory of one person, and conceivably, there are people who are still alive today who might remember that. So we're walking through that little park, that natural area at Drumheller Springs, and I'm telling her this whole story about, I've been trying to go out and get some bitter roots. I just can't seem to find any. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I look around, and all around me are these beautiful pink flowers coming up out of the coming up out of the rocks. And I, oh my gosh, I'm standing in a massive field of bitter roots. And if you ever go there during the right time of the year, you see it, it's just beautiful. The rocks just light up with these beautiful pink flowers. And so I ended up going in there, and I got just a few, and I don't even know if that's legal or not. It's a city park. But
so is that the plant that we call Lewisia?
Yeah, Lewisia.
And what is the Spokane word?
Speculum. Speculum. And so I went back and I spent some time there and found out that there are all kinds of plants growing there that we would have gathered. And speaking about this, this waking up the land, I was out there digging some of these roots, and this thought came to my mind. I said, I wonder how long it's been since anyone in our family or our tribe or our people have been here digging these roots. I wonder how long it's been. And there was sort of this emotional feeling that came over me, thinking that however long it's been, that the plants that are here and that the beings that are here, that they remember. And there was this sense of happiness that I felt, and this connection like meeting long lost friends again. It's kind of difficult to describe or what that would have been like or what that was like. But it was a very emotional thing for me. So I sat down on one of those little hillsides and I cried for a little bit, and and got up and continued on the way. So I try to every once in a while we bring school groups there and other groups, and we talk about what was going on there, and just this last spring. I brought a school group there, about 19 or 20 kids and some of their parents, and afterwards one of the moms comes up to me, and she's quite visibly moved and feeling very emotional, and so I talk with her a little bit, trying to find out what's that about exactly, and she's telling me that she'd lived here for I don't know how many number of years, and saying all these years that I've lived here, I look out my window, I never knew what these things were. I didn't know the importance of the things that were growing in my own backyard. And my comment to that was, this is why I do this, because you can't love what you don't know. And I always say, I don't know that it can necessarily be the same as the relationship that tribal peoples have, but anybody who lives here can begin to have a relationship with the plants, with the animals, with the landscape that's here, and can begin to nurture that relationship and to have some of those same kinds of perceptions and experiences. And if that begins to happen, then I feel that's that we've succeeded. And again, you can't love what you don't know. And so it starts by knowing the names and knowing some of the stories and knowing some of the history and knowing some of the connections that people here already have, and beginning to form your own connections to the landscape here. The connection that we have, there's, of course there's an ancestral connection that's been going on for, I don't know how many thousands of years, where we've been on this spot and been eating the same foods and been in relationship to these things, for a long time. And my dad used to say that that essentially our foods and our medicines were synonymous. He would often refer to our foods as medicines. And so if people were feeling sick, or people were even sort of, psychologically, if people were feeling depressed, or disconnected, or, from things, he would always say, well, you need to eat a little bit of our foods, of our medicine, and you'll feel better. And I certainly do. I know that when I've been away from it for too long, and I enjoy, fast food just as much as anybody else, these days. But it's a different thing, going out and knowing that I'm in a relationship to these plants and to these foods, and it creates quite a different experience to eat in that way than it does just going and buying something at the store or at a fast food place. One thing that I didn't have the chance to talk about earlier was the salmon. The impact that had on tribal peoples in this area was, I think, really can't be overstated. And as I mentioned earlier, the people here depended on the salmon for not just for the diet, but there was, as we mentioned earlier, a spiritual relationship between the fish, between the salmon, and between the people. I had the opportunity a couple years ago to see some of the archival photographs at the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture about the construction of Grand Coulee Dam and some of the effects that had on Native peoples. And they were talking about the ceremony of tears that happened at Kettle Falls as the water was coming up. And it was very moving for me as a Native person to see those photographs and to see the people lined up along that embankment, and some of them, and they had their arms out and like sort of like bidding farewell to a friend, kind of thing. It was very, very emotional to see those photographs and to imagine what that must have been like for them. And here we are all these years later. That was years, decades before I was born. And yet I think somewhere in my own heart I do feel that impact as well. It's like there's a piece of the culture that's missing from what we do here. And as I mentioned earlier, down by Spokane House, how we traveled to the different places, gathering the different kinds of foods, and that's something that my family still does, and we still go and we still gather those foods and still collect those things. And that's the one piece that's missing for us is the salmon. And in my own experience, I just go to the store, and it's just something that I buy, and it's always something that it feels like there's a piece of my heart that's missing, from not having that. And I suppose I could go to the coast or could go someplace else, but it really wouldn't be the same. And so in my own mind, sometimes I imagine what that would be like for the salmon to come back up this river, and it's hard to put words on what that would feel like. To see them coming up the river again. And I can only imagine how wonderful that would be, and how emotional that would be to see that relationship restored, not just with the river, but with the people and the animals and all the creations that are here on this spot. And that'd be a dream come true.